Today is a feast day of one of the doctors of the Catholic Church. Her name is St. Catherine of Siena. So happy feast day to all the Catherines out there. Today is April 29th. The doctors of the Church. They are canonized saints whom the popes, through the different generations, have named as being some of the greatest teachers of the Catholic faith. Teachers of the faith either through words, their preaching, their words of writing, or through their example, their deeds. St. Catherine of Siena is one of the three female doctors of the Church, along with St. Therese of Lisieux and St. Teresa of Avila. St. Catherine of Siena, Italy, was born in 1347, and she came from a very large family. 25 were born in that family. Only half of them survived childbirth, and St. Catherine, who was born with a twin, she had survived childbirth. She didn't live too long, only 33 years old, but she was born during the time of Black Death, a plague that destroyed many countries in Europe, a plague that came from China. Believe it or not, it seems like history is repeating itself, but the Black Death was particularly bad during that time. She survived. And there are a few factors that distinguish St. Catherine of Siena. I'm going to talk about a few of them. The first, her spiritual life. She was not a religious sister as such, but she did dedicate her entire life, 33 years, to prayer and service to the Church. Her spiritual life. What made her a unique saint in that area? There are things that happened to St. Catherine that were invisible, and that's part of the spiritual life. Things happening to us that maybe nobody else sees, but we know to be true. It started when she was a young woman. In her prayer, she offered to dedicate herself entirely to service to Christ and the Church. And during a time of prayer, she received from Christ a ring to seal that commitment. And she said that ring was on her for her entire life, but nobody else could see it. Yet she believed, and she said it was there. So that's one invisible thing that happened to her. And then later, towards the end of her life, she received something called the stigmata. And we may have heard St. Francis of Assisi, the first known saint who received the stigmata, and that's the marking on the hands and the feet, and the side, the same wounds that Christ had when he was crucified. St. Catherine of Siena received the stigmata when she was in prayer, after communion, and this is what a lot of Catholics do to this day. You pray and you look at the crucifix. And with St. Catherine, she said, and a lot of this is in her book, The Dialogues, a lot of spiritual reflections are in that book. She said that from the crucifix came red rays of light from Jesus that came and that she absorbed, and that gave her the stigmata. And also, she would indicate that she received the crown of thorns. And Jesus gave her a choice. You can receive the crown of thorns now, in this life, or you can receive a crown of gold while you are living. But if you receive the crown of gold now, you get the crown of thorns later. If you get the crown of thorns now in your life that you're living, later you'll get the crown of gold, representing the rewards of heaven. And so she chose the crown of thorns. So she had that in the invisible sense for the rest of her life. And afterwards, at her death, those who were gathered around her looked at her, and it appeared to them, there they are, the wounds. So they were not able to see the wounds until her death, which was a proof to them all that she wasn't lying. She was being truthful about this. Everything that she said that she received from Jesus, she received. It's just that nobody else could see it. And that's part of the spiritual life. And then finally, with the spiritual life, she was somebody who fasted very often. She did not anticipate through each day all the great treats that she would eat. Rather, she would abstain from food to be in solidarity with the poor, those who could not afford too much, and also she received communion on a very regular basis. She was a saint known for living off of Holy Communion for months at a time. So that's about her spiritual life. In regard to her life of service, she's one of the patron saints of nurses. And in another way, she's like St. Francis of Assisi again. First, with the stigmata, and then second, whom she ministered to. St. Francis of Assisi was known to go out of his way to be with the lepers. And part of that was to challenge himself, because he had a revulsion to those who had that kind of physical sickness. And so he went out of his way to be converted from his personal revulsions to service of Christ, to serving the very least among everybody. And similar with St. Catherine. She nursed, in particular, one of these stories, a Dominican sister who was dying of breast cancer. And this Dominican sister was being isolated, not only because of the sickness, but because of the stench that she gave off. Because similar to the leper, her wounds were open and she was in bad shape. And Catherine of Siena went out of her way when everybody else was staying away from the dying religious sister. St. Catherine went to her and spent hours with her to attend to her. And that was part of her conversion. And it's one of those things, saints try to live it out. Not my will, but your will be done. And so she attended at the bedside of the dying. So that was her form of service. And then also, Catherine of Siena, if you look it up today, Pope Francis has asked for her intercession because she's one of the patron saints of all of Europe. Why? Even though she died as a young woman, she had a big impact politically. We are accustomed to see women elected as governors in Congress, the House, and the Senate. St. Catherine of Siena mixed it up politically, and she was not afraid to do so as a young woman to her last days. It is usually advocating on behalf of the church in region in Italy. But the big political issue during her time was the popes. The popes had left Rome and went to Avignon, France, to set up their operations. And St. Catherine of Siena went to France and confronted the popes, saying, "You have got to come back." Why? This is where Peter set up the Church of Christ. These are where his bones are buried. This was the will of God, to have the church established here in Rome. We are waiting for you. Come back. Be faithful to your office. So St. Catherine of Siena, as a young woman, succeeded where many men, diplomats, kings, and lords failed. She convinced the Pope to return to Rome, and she was able to do so before her own death at the age of 33. A couple quotes to close with St. Catherine. And again, you can look her up, look at some of those artwork images. She was a third order Dominican, so you see her in black and white very often, and you'll oftentimes see her portrayed with the crown of thorns around her that is visible in the artwork, and she experienced that in the invisible sense for the entirety of her life. Here are a couple quotes. "Proclaim the truth. Do not be silent in fear." There are a couple truths. There are the truths of this world, reality, that she confronted the popes on, go back to Rome, and the spiritual truths. What she experienced in prayer and what she knew about Jesus was true, and it all proved to be so. So proclaim it without fear, even if it seems like it might cost you friendships or credibility. Proclaim it without fear. And the last quote, "Be who God meant you to be, and you will set the world on fire." God has a plan for everybody. Here it is again. Be who God meant you to be, and you will set the world on fire. Using your talents, your abilities, and what God is asking you to do. You set the world on fire by getting rid of the bad and restoring the good, because the fire is the fire of the Holy Spirit. And that's the kind of fire that the Lord wants to set loose in this world. So, St. Catherine of Siena, today is her feast day, one of the doctors of the Church.